The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to another SLA Competitive Intelligence Division webinar. Today we're going to be hearing from Peter Grimm, who is the CEO of Cypher Systems. Peter has a Bachelor of Science in History from the U.S. Naval Academy, as well as a Master's of Strategic Intelligence from the National Intelligence University. And today, Peter is going to be talking to us about trend monitoring and the importance of it to the CI function and what to be looking for. So, great topic. And at that, Peter, take it away.
Great, thank you, Tim, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Good afternoon to everybody on the East Coast, everybody out west. Good morning. And if there's any Europeans, I think we had one or two joining us today. Good evening to you guys. So as Tim said, what we'll talk about today is kind of the basics of trend monitoring and applying some analytic techniques that come out of the national security space to really put some structure around the way we think about trends in the marketplace, competitive trends, and how we can use those analytic techniques to see things coming. So a little bit about myself, as Jason said, I went to the Naval Academy. I grew up, as many probably of you have seen the movie Top Gun. I saw that when I was relatively young and thought that was the coolest thing in the world and decided I wanted to be Maverick. So that led me to the Naval Academy. Unfortunately, my eyes did not cooperate, so I wound up driving ships in the Navy. My first ship there, the USS Fletcher, in the far left is a fun fact about her. She is now a coral reef off the coast of Kauai. A pretty old ship when I was on her, even older now. From there, I went into a special boat unit, so I was more or less, it's a good way to think about that, as kind of a bus driver for the SEALs. So those small boats that you see there, we were responsible for inserting and extracting Navy SEALs. So we'd send them off to the beach and they would do whatever they were going to do that they couldn't tell us about, and we'd pick them up afterwards. After the Navy, I went into the government as a civilian intelligence analyst and worked at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I worked on counterterrorism, spent a lot of time looking at, as you might imagine, Iraq and the terrorist groups that were operating there in the mid-2000s. Those pictures of me there from the 2006-2007 timeframe. And the slides that you see there are kind of representative of some of the work we did there. So it was really about sort of targeting bad guys and understanding how that organization operated and what we could do to defeat it. From there, I went, like every young intelligence analyst, into management consulting. So I found my way to Deloitte and spent several years there working first in the government practice, but then migrated into commercial strategy, so worked across a number of different industries there. And I came to Cypher almost 5 years ago at this point as the CEO. And so we're a small boutique competitive strategy and technology firm. So that's a little bit about me. So what we'll talk about today, we'll talk a little bit about what are trends and why we should care about them. We'll talk about, as I said, a structured way to think about trend analysis using a couple different analytic techniques that I'll talk a little bit about. We'll talk about how we scope the problem because, you know, there are a lot of trends in the world. There are a lot of things happening in various markets. There's lots of things going on in the world. The pace of change is very rapid. So it's important that we kind of put some boundaries around what we're going to examine and what we can pay attention to on an ongoing basis. We simply can't look at everything. So how do we figure out where we should be looking? So we'll talk about how we use differentiation to accomplish that. From there, I'll talk a little bit about indications and warning intelligence. This is, again, an analytic principle that comes out of the national security world. It is not new. It's been around since really the dawn of the Cold War. And we'll talk about how some of the principles of INW can be applied into the context of the commercial world and predicting disruption and monitoring trends and those sorts of things. And then we'll talk at the end here through a brief case study around a project that we did with one of our clients involving some of these principles. So that's kind of our agenda. From there, after I give you my sort of military guy background, I love to show a picture of two hipsters. So I show this picture for a couple reasons. One, I would ask you guys, we're going to do a quick poll question here, and I would love all of you to participate. But if you look at this picture and see these two gentlemen, I'd ask you to think about what consumer or sort of business model trends are related to this picture. So if you give that a couple quick seconds, I think Jim is going to put up a poll question, and I'd ask you just to very quickly go in and give us a quick answer. And we'll come back to the results here in about a minute or so. And Jim, just let me know when you think we're good.
Okay, 5 more seconds.
Okay.
Okay, we've closed the poll.
All right. Are we able to take a look at some of the responses?
There you go. So there are your results.
Okay, can everybody see them? Jim, I actually can't see the results.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I think I got it now. All right, so large measure of you picked up on the first one. So, facial hair is, as kind of a social trend, is becoming more popular for men, especially millennial men. A number of you guys picked up on the sale of men's grooming products decreasing. We had a couple of you, it looks like, that picked up on subscription business models. And good, a lot of you picked up on all of the above. Now, there's a variety of other trends we could talk about related to this, but the key two that I generally pick up on, and when we do this in a live setting and we kind of open it up for suggestions, you get some wild ones sometimes. But the two that I think are most critical and that we'll spend some time talking about are the changes in grooming habits and what that means from a consumer product standpoint. So obviously, when you have more and more gentlemen like these guys sort of eschewing the traditional razor, you're going to see decreased razor sales. You are also seeing, particularly in this segment, the rise of subscription business models that are so prevalent in many other industries. But this one's very interesting for a couple reasons. So if we think about Dollar Shave Club in particular, and the impact that business model has had on what's a pretty traditional segment, men's grooming within big consumer products companies. If you look at Procter & Gamble, the orange line on this slide represents the net sales for Procter & Gamble's grooming segment over the period of 2012 to 2016. So you can see it looks like a relatively modest decline there. But when you look at the scale of those numbers, we're actually talking about $1.5 billion off of Procter & Gamble's net sales in the grooming segment over 4 years. In that same time period, the blue line there represents Dollar Shave Club's valuation. So in 2012, that company was valued at about $6 million. They'd gotten seed funding for under $1 million. In 2016, as many of you are, I'm sure, well aware, they were acquired by Unilever for $1 billion. So just to, I think this is a good example of just how quickly things change in today's day and age, and why it's so important to be able to understand trends early. Another good example of this, I love this slide. This was done by a gentleman named Horace Beidou. And this shows really the trend lines of adoption of various consumer technologies in the United States over time. So if you look at the left hand, kind of the bottom left corner, 1900, the telephone, thereabouts is introduced slightly before 1900. And it took all the way out until about 1956, 1958 timeframe for the telephone to reach, up around 91% penetration of the U.S. market. So you're talking about a 50-year period, almost 60 years, for that technology to really penetrate the U.S. Contrast that against sort of the bottom right-hand corner. If you look in kind of the 2008 time period when many of you guys will remember the iPhone was introduced, you see that red line there that's labeled smartphone. Really, we're talking about the iPhone. And in a period of about 6 years, that went from effectively zero penetration to almost 90% penetration. So just an incredible acceleration in the pace of change over time. Obviously true in consumer products, but true in a lot of other industries as well. So let's talk a little bit about what a trend is and what it's not. So the key thing here is that a trend is fundamentally it's a pattern. It's a pattern of change, either in the way a market, a region, capability, business is developing. So it's not a single event. It is not a series of disconnected events. They are, comprised of a series of events that are a pattern within a particular industry. So we talk a lot about healthcare. The case study we'll look at today is from healthcare. We talk a lot about the kind of changing regulatory environment, the uncertainty in the regulatory environment, particularly in the U.S., around the Affordable Care Act and other regulatory initiatives with the change of administration. There's a ton of uncertainty. When they change a particular regulation, though, that is not in and of itself a trend. It doesn't really give us a diagnostic that we can use to infer or make any predictions about what will happen in the future. So why do we care about trend monitoring, right? Those logos will be familiar to most of you, I think, on the right-hand side. We have kind of a saying that we use pretty frequently around here, and we just, it's business as usual. Generally, it means less business in the future. So we have so many new innovative business models enabled by technology. It's moving so quickly that the potential for our own kind of human limitations, our cognitive biases, make it very difficult to see clearly what's happening in real time and to make accurate predictions about where things are heading. But the next point that's kind of critical here is that when you are big and strong and successful as a company, particularly a company that's been around a while, things are going quite well, it is very, very difficult to go through these exercises in a meaningful way and think about where we are vulnerable to disruption. And there's a whole variety of reasons behind that, but I will tell you that kind of the bigger and more successful you are, the more difficult this can be to go through this process. So, another reason that trends are important, ideally, from a strategic planning standpoint, there's a great quote from, it's often attributed to Wayne Gretzky. It's, highly overused. Hockey fans will have heard it before. It's actually from Wayne's father. But the quote is, skate to where the puck is going to be, not to where it's been. And the notion there is that we need to be able to predict how the environment is developing so that we can plan to position ourselves for that new market. So if you look at these two graphics here, left and right, many, particularly large organizations, but just human organizations in general, tend to suffer from what we would call incrementalism. So there's kind of the notion of the tyranny of the urgent, right? So what's on my plate right now? In the military, we would refer to that as what's the 50-meter target that I need to be worried about today? And it can be very difficult to do the type of thinking you need to do to think about, what's my environment going to look like forget about tomorrow, forget about this quarter. What's my environment, my market, my competitive landscape going to look like in 3 years, in 5 years? And how do we want to fit into that? Where do we want to be within that future environment? And then to be able to do sort of the reverse logic or the backward planning to say, what do we need to do along the way to make sure we are where we want to be in 3 years or 5 years? So in order to be able to do that, we need to understand what the trends are and how those are going to impact our environment over our planning horizon, whatever that is, whether it's 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, whatever the case might be. So that's, the ability to sort of identify, understand, and analyze these trends is really important to be able to do effective strategic planning. So let's talk about a little bit about just kind of how we think as human beings. So there's really 4 kinds of logic, right? If you look across the literature, there's deductive, kind of your standard, I'm going to go do a bunch of research, I'm going to dig down into the data, and eventually, I will find an answer. Inductive, the example we like to use is if you're in a group setting, you would ask maybe, on this call, I could ask 10 people for your answer, and then I draw a big sort of Venn diagram of all the different answers that I heard, and I would keep the overlap. So where we are all in agreement, I would keep that as my answer and basically reject all the outlying answers. Reverse logic, this is sort of my favorite. It's also very, very useful from an intelligence analysis standpoint, also incredibly useful from a strategy standpoint. The kind of group dynamic example here would be to take that same group of 10 people, ask them all for one piece of the answer. So, I might get 10 different sentences, and in those sentences, there are different combinations of words. So I would take different pieces of each of those answers, and then as kind of like a bricklayer, the masonry notion, I would cobble those together and I would have my answer. It's really about asking what conditions have to be met for a particular answer to work. And we'll talk more about why that's important from a strategy standpoint. And then lastly, converse logic, that's really, what is not the answer? How do the process of elimination, how do I chip away at the problem to reveal the answer? And the sort of analog there might be a sculptor, sort of chipping away little pieces of rock to reveal our answer. So as I said, reverse logic tends to be the most important and most effective when we're talking about strategic problem solving. If you guys will indulge me just a moment here, I want to talk a little bit about how strategists should think, and this hopefully will make sense in the context of trend monitoring. This is a concept that I first learned from a gentleman named Fred Pollard, who's an old Deloitte consultant. He's now out on his own. I encourage you guys to check out his website. He's a brilliant guy, and he still does training, I believe, with Deloitte for young consultants there. But he put this together, and he talks about sort of 4 paths from complexity to conviction. So if we start a very complex problem like strategic planning or making a strategic decision, we sort of start in the bottom left-hand corner of this matrix or this graph, and we have a lot of complexity. We have a lot of moving pieces. We have a lot of different trends that might be impacting things. There's uncertainty, lots of unknowns. Our goal is to get to the upper right-hand corner here, what we call conviction. So not only are we certain about the answer, but we feel a real conviction that this is the right decision, and we've done all the required analysis. So Fred talks about sort of 4 paths from the bottom left to the top right. The first one would be what he refers to as the expert route. So this is sort of, if you think about a good example of this might be IT consultants. So we start with a very complex problem. We're going to do an ERP migration, or we're going to migrate you from whatever CRM you're on onto Salesforce. An IT consultant will look at that and say, I know exactly the path from complexity to conviction. I've done this exact same project multiple times. We have a work plan. There's generally sort of incremental steps with gate reviews and so forth and milestones. But more or less, we're going to go linearly from complexity to conviction. The second one will be familiar to all of you if you've done any higher education. This is the analytical route. This is sort of the favorite of academics, also a favorite in certain professions. So if you think about sort of professions who live down in the data, I'm going to, you know, as we talked about before with the sort of deductive reasoning, I'm going to go get as much data as I possibly can. I'm going to put it all together. I'm going to go through it and I'm going to chug through that data, and eventually I'll have this aha moment where the answer emerges out of this massive data. And so again, if you think about the professions that would kind of employ this type of thinking, you're talking about lawyers, accountants, engineers, academics. You know, this suits certain professions pretty well because they bill by the hour. No offense to any lawyers, accountants, or engineers out there. But you know, we're going to take as much data as we possibly can. We're going to process it in some sort of analytical process, and then we're going to sort of, at the end, rise up and say, okay, I have the answer. Fred would tell you there's a third way, what he refers to as the creative route. So we're, instead of going, you know, from complexity to certainty by going, you know, data, or going on a linear route like an IT consultant because I already know where I'm going. Creative route, you don't necessarily know where we're going. So what we need to do is get some clarity, and we accomplish that by structuring the problem with options. So if you think about architects or advertising executives, one of the first things they're going to do if you hire an architect to build a house, they'll come back to you with 3 options. And they'll say, here's, you know, kind of a modern version, here's a real traditional version, and here's this third version that's my personal style. And they can very quickly get feedback from you around what your preferences are, what you like about certain things, what might be the right answer, what path should we follow from here. So that's kind of what we refer to as a creative route. The last route is what's really most important and most effective in a strategic context, rather. So if we think about the strategic route, starting off like the architects, we're going to structure a very complex problem with a number of options. So, you know, I know that I need to pick a strategy from the next 3 years, and it's going to be, you know, it's either going to be acquisitive or it's going to be organic, or it might be a combination. And there's a whole variety of different options that we can array, but we need to structure the problem first so that we can get to likely right answers and likely wrong answers. But that's not enough, right? Because we're making important decisions with lots of money on the line and lots of other interests. So we need to go validate our options with data. So we actually, you know, we go from complexity straight up into clarity. We've got our options. Then we're going to dive back down into certainty and validate our options with data, and eventually arise back up into conviction. So if you think about this, this is how doctors think. If you go to the emergency room, you're going to say, you know, the doctor's going to say, okay, you have symptom A, symptom B, symptom C. That means you likely have one of these 4 conditions. So now I've structured it with options, but now we're going to run some tests so we can figure out which of those 4 conditions you probably have. So that's validating it with data, and then they arrive back to conviction, okay? So how do we structure, when we talk about trend monitoring, how do we structure things? Excuse me just a second, I want to take a sip of water. So one of the things we talk about to apply structure to these complex issues is kind of a hierarchy of trends, or if you think of it, kind of stratifying trends. We talk about mega trends, macro trends, micro trends. And so the importance here is not necessarily that a particular trend is classified with one of these labels that we just created, but it is more important the relationship between them and the fact that there are trends that drive smaller trends that drive smaller trends. And it's been pretty universal in our experiences. If you think about a particular market, you think about a particular industry, you can apply this general framework. It's very simple, but it gives you a good way to sort of structure your thinking around the trends that are going to impact our business. Mega trends you might think of as things like globalization, right? So that it applies basically to everybody. And as we walk down these sort of into these smaller trends, their implications are not as broad. They impact a smaller group. They might only impact one industry or a couple of industries and so forth. And we'll see some examples of that going forward. But this is just one quick way that we talk about in terms of structuring our thinking. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. This is just kind of an overall approach that we use to projects like this, where we'll talk about how do we align with differentiation and strategy? We'll talk more about that in a second. Identifying the trends, stratifying those trends, understanding what's driving what other trends, and so forth. From there, we'll go into a discussion around what are the potential disruptors that those trends could birth for us. We'll talk about opportunities, and then we'll go into things we can do like wargaming and monitoring indicators and so forth. But again, I won't spend a ton of time on this slide today. Let's talk about differentiation. So we talked about, how do we scope this problem? There's so many things happening. There's so much to pay attention to. How do we understand what is signal versus noise? One way that we tackle this is we talk with companies about differentiation. And this seems simple at first, but when you really think critically about this, it gets much more complicated. And I can tell you from having done this with companies and, many, many companies in lots of different industries, this conversation's always harder than you think. So we'll have a discussion with, a variety of stakeholders within the company. We might have marketing, sales, somebody from the C-suite or maybe multiple players from the C-suite. We might have R&D, we might have a product team, and so forth. You get these people around the table and you ask what differentiates you in the market, whether we're talking about, the whole corporation, a certain business unit, a certain product even. And you will get as many different answers as there are people in the room. Now, you'll generally get a couple of the same answers because they've heard those from the marketing department. And that's what marketing is telling our customers and prospects. Here is what differentiates us. That may or may not be the case, though, when you really boil it down. We talk a lot about the difference between a true differentiator or table stakes, right? So when we talk about table stakes, it's a poker term. What's the minimum that I have to be able to do, the minimum value proposition I have to even compete in this market or in this segment? And when you really, as I said, when you think critically about these things, you ask a company what differentiates you, and they'll say, well, we have the best people. When I can turn around to them and say, well, that's what all three of your competitors told me to. So that's not really a differentiator, guys. And by the way, they could all leave and go to your competitor tomorrow. So let's really think through what the true differentiation is. And so why do we care about that? We care about that because that's what we're trying to protect. If we're talking about disruption, we're talking about trend monitoring, how is this going to impact my business? Really, fundamentally, it boils down to how is this trend, how is this disruption going to impact my differentiation in the market? So that's why we kind of start there. We normally talk through kind of asking folks in the audience, what are some things that set your company apart and why is this so hard? Again, regardless of the group I've done this with, the size of the group, the composition of the group, we always, start to peel back the onion a little bit, and you will see that it's a lot more difficult than you thought it was. From there, we want to talk about disruptors, right? So identifying potential disruptors that could result from these trends and the impact of those trends on our differentiation. Fundamentally, that's what we're talking about when we talk about disruptors. Could be competitor movements, new technologies, new business models, and so forth. And, again, it goes to how can it impact or how will they impact your differentiation in the market? Okay, I'm going a bit quickly here. I want to make sure we keep some time for Q&A at the end. Please bear with me, but let's talk a little bit about indications and warning intelligence. So as I said, this came out of the national security world, really as an analytical method that intelligence analysts could use to say, I need more warning if the Soviet Union is going to launch a nuclear missile at the United States. My first indication of that cannot be the missile in the sky coming toward me. How do I predict this ahead of time? And what are the things that will happen before a launch that I can predict? That's fundamentally where this comes from. But really what we're talking about are quantifiable measures or metrics that can be monitored, that can help predict movement towards an event of concern or an outcome of concern. That's the indicators part. The warning is all about communication and how you communicate that to an audience that's empowered to make a decision. It has to carry a sense of urgency. It also has to focus on the opportunities to counter the threat or take advantage of the threat. One thing when we talk about this, people immediately start to turn into Chicken Little and say, well, we've got to warn executives of all these threats and disruptions. Yes, that's important, but it's more important that we enable them to make good decisions about how they can take advantage and how they can, in some cases, leverage these trends to their advantage, right, to our advantage. Quick example just from the real world of national security. This is actually something I worked on back in 2006. Anybody that was reading the news at that point or watching cable news, lots of talk in Iraq about is Iraq in a civil war? And so this was a slide that we put together in support of General Petraeus, who had to come back to Congress once a quarter and update them on sort of how the progress was going. If you recall, this was when we did the big surge of troops into Iraq. There was a lot of scrutiny, rightfully so. But what you see here is a couple things. This is not my favorite example, by the way, but it is one I worked on. A couple things you see quickly are color. That communicates sort of the severity of the issue. You see arrows that indicate trends. So in these particular indicators, each of these line items that you see are what we would refer to as an indicator of civil war. Again, all subjective judgment, just putting it in a framework so we can communicate it more effectively. You can see, what's changed since last week. And then on the right-hand side there in that sort of inset box, you can see what the overall trend is. So we talked about this last week. It was here. Currently, it's a little worse than last week. So a couple key elements of the communication aspect of warning. So how do we apply that in a commercial context? So you see this quite often in life sciences, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, biotech, those types of industries. Many of you who work in those industries probably will be familiar with what's on the screen now. This is from the FDA. This is a very sort of generic overview of I believe this is the medical device product development cycle that they talk about. So all these different phases of discovery and ideation, moving into prototyping, sort of preclinical design, clinical trials, regulatory decision, which is where FDA would come into play in the US. Then the product gets launched, and then FDA monitors after that. So the reason I show this is because when we're talking about indicators, we are talking about things that necessarily have to happen before whatever we're concerned about can happen. So again, going back to kind of that notion of reverse logic, what conditions would have to be met in order for this event to happen, right? So in order for my competitor, in this instance, to launch a new drug or a new medical device, they will necessarily have had to go through these steps or some version thereof that are to the left of product launch in this graphic. Now, within those steps, there are things that are discoverable to others. So, when they're doing discovery and ideation, some of that could be discoverable in the shape, most commonly of sort of academic research papers that are public and can be monitored. Invention and prototyping, that you might see that manifest in a discoverable way in terms of a partnership with a design firm, or you might see, they hire a certain scientist with a particular expertise. All along the way, and then it gets more and more discoverable the closer you get to the launch. Clinical trials, a lot of that data is public. There's several ways to get access to that. Some of the data in terms of the status of regulatory decisions is public. There's sunlight laws in the US that require these companies to report about how frequently they're interacting with healthcare providers. That's public data. So there's lots of things that we can see along the way before this competitive product comes to market. So the process of identifying those indicators, those necessary precursors, and then figuring out how we're going to monitor or see them is kind of the basic principle of INW. So a couple key lessons learned before we just go into the case study that I'll share with you here in a second. Start small, right? And we can't monitor everything. You can't boil the ocean. There's so much noise out there. There's so much change. You have to really figure out how to scope it. And we think the best way to do that, there are a number of ways, but the best way to do it in our experience is talking about your differentiation. Prioritizing effort based on probability of occurrence, level of impact, and timing. So this is kind of the classic risk matrix of what's the chance something bad happens, how bad will it be, and how soon is it going to happen? Importantly, capturing opportunities. We talked about, we can't become Chicken Little in this context. We certainly don't want to overwarn. We want to use this process to identify opportunities to turn these things to our advantage. Providing recommendations and focusing on the so what. I guarantee you that if you put sort of a warning communication in front of the executive without a perspective on what they should do about it or how they could turn it to their advantage, you're not going to get probably another chance in front of that executive. Other basics, sort of assigning responsibility and setting a battle rhythm. This goes to, we'll talk more about this in the case study, but sort of many of these things you will find where we're looking for indicators and we need to monitor a particular set of data or information to see that indicator. Most of the time, we'll find that somebody in the company is already looking there. So it's more just a question, a good example is patents, right? So, in the medical device context, certainly, a patent filing or multiple patent filings is part of the product development cycle before something comes to market. Almost always, all of these companies have lawyers that or legal departments, compliance departments that are looking at patents all day, every day. It's more a question of sensitizing them to what they need to be looking for from a competitive standpoint, and leveraging the work that's already going on across the organization. In developing contingency plans and alternate strategic options, again, if we can identify that a trend is coming or a disruption is coming, what are we going to do about it? How do we leverage that knowledge to get out ahead of it? And then identifying the action points or sort of the triggers where we would take a decision or take an action in response to a particular trend. Let's talk very quickly about this case study, and we should be able to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you recall, we talked about kind of stratifying trends. This is, and forgive me very quickly, this is a case that we did with Olympus. I love the fact that, I use this one pretty frequently because it is Olympus. And if you think about, you ask a room of people what they know about Olympus, many of them will say cameras. They are sort of a perfect, you can almost put their logo next to BlackBerry on that previous slide. They don't make a lot of cameras anymore. That's been largely displaced by smartphones and the iPhone and others. But however, they are primarily a medical device company. They make optics and optical scopes and things that doctors use to look inside you and do various procedures. So we did a project with them a couple years ago where we looked at, they were going through their own product development cycle. And for those of you with kids, or if you've ever had yourself sort of chronic ear infections, the treatment for that has been the same for about 60 years. And that is, the doctor will insert little plastic tubes into the eardrum so that they can allow the bad stuff back there from the infection to drain and to get medicine back behind the eardrum. So Olympus makes some of the devices that are used in that procedure, and they were about to embark on a pretty sizable investment in terms of developing a new product to basically do the same thing more effectively, more quickly, more efficiently, less invasively. So we did some stress testing with them. The first thing we said, as you can see on the slide here, we said, let's talk about the trends in the market. So we talked about mega trends from a healthcare standpoint. And this was the result of kind of a facilitated session with I think we had about 25 people from Olympus over the course of a couple of days. But the first step was, let's talk about mega trends. So they talked about things like value-based healthcare. The idea that, providers are now being compensated on the basis of outcomes as opposed to the quantity of service delivered. So they may not be reimbursed because they MRI'd your knee 6 times. The payers now care more about how that knee healed over time. That's a gross generalization, but fundamentally that's kind of the concept. Lots of cost pressures in healthcare. It's all over the news. It has been for years at this point. Everybody is looking for ways to save costs. It's related to the evolving stakeholder landscape. For years and years, medical device companies, pharmaceutical companies, their key constituent, their key customer was the physician themselves. So they had, sales reps out in the field talking to physicians and selling the physician on the superiority of their product from a medical standpoint or ease of use or whatever the the value proposition might have been. Now the stakeholder landscape is changing for these companies. They find themselves selling to hospital administrators who are in many cases not doctors. So those points of value don't resonate in the same way. They care a lot more about things like cost. They care a lot more about things like readmission rates and other sort of metrics that are not necessarily, purely medical in nature. So if we take a step down from there and we look at what are these trends driving in Olympus's space specifically, you see things like the shift from inpatient to outpatient. So, putting tubes in children's ears is a good example. They were, and as a matter of fact, this product development effort was a result of this trend where they were trying to get that procedure, which historically required general anesthesia and, an operating room, into an outpatient setting. So can we do this in the ambulatory surgery center? Can we do it in a doctor's office? Trying to get things out of the OR to the office, to the clinic. And related to that is, how do we do things in a less invasive way that requires less anesthesia, less downtime, less complicated healing. From there, we stepped a level deeper and said, okay, well, what are those driving? And the group basically came up with, this is a subset, obviously, of what they came up with, but they focused on robotic surgery, miniaturization of basically the instruments and the devices themselves such that they could be less invasive. And then, sort of interestingly, as this discussion developed, this notion of alternative non-surgical options kind of rose to the fore. And really what we were talking about there is, somebody in the room said, well, what if somebody comes up with a drug that they could put into the ear that would get behind the eardrum, that could penetrate the tympanic membrane? Well, then guess what? Nobody needs tubes anymore. And this whole effort we're about to embark on is going to be for naught. And by the way, this entire line of business is going to be at risk. And there were others that sort of percolated out of that discussion. So that's where we're going to focus today, and we'll talk a little bit more about what came out of that. So potential disruptors in terms of alternative non-surgical options, right? A new non-surgical treatment modality like a drug that could get through your eardrum. What if somebody comes up with a vaccine that could, basically eliminate childhood ear infections? Again, hugely disruptive if I make the instrument to put eustachian tubes in children's ears. And then the last one is a little bit more traditional. What if somebody else comes up with comes to market with a similar device to the one they were working on at the time? So we said, well, what would be, for each of these, what would be the indicators, those necessary precursors that would have to happen first before a non-surgical middle ear drug delivery modality came to the market? And this is kind of what they came up with. And again, this was over the course of kind of group discussion in a facilitated way, but it would start with kind of academic research. There'd be some funding in the shape of grants or, additional technologies, adjacent technologies. There'd be probably some personnel moves associated with it. There would certainly be IP filings, patents, trademarks, and so forth. There might be kind of atypical partnerships. There would be some healthcare provider contacts that we might be able to discover. It would absolutely have to go through clinical trials. It would have to go through regulatory filings. It would have to go through code submissions with the insurance companies to get all the reimbursement codes squared away. And then, as you kind of get closer to launch, you would see some of these other, marketing activities and that sort of thing. So they put, an initial sort of assessment in terms of where each of these indicators were. Have we seen any activity that would indicate, that there's academic research going on that could lead to the emergence of a non-surgical treatment modality? Have we seen, any clinical trials that might be related to this? Have we seen any code submissions? And we said, no, there haven't been any code submissions. Okay, and we haven't seen marketing activities, but we've seen some patents, we've seen some FDA filings that, may or may not be quite related. We can't really tell. So that's where this framework, to be able to put it in the context of all these other things, is really, really helpful. So then we put them on a timeline like we talked about. So, these things generally will happen in order. And so their assessment was this academic research is probably going to be happening anywhere from 5 to 8 years before a product would come to the market. There'd be a period in there where there'd be, maybe venture capital funding or one of the big, pharmaceutical companies or Big healthcare companies, venture funds might deploy some capital against this. There'd be patents and trademarks and so forth. And then as we get further on the right on this timeline, closer to the launch of this product, we'd see, supply relationships, distribution relationships, code submissions, clinical trials, and so forth. So that was kind of the timeline that they came up with. This is very complicated, but fundamentally, this is kind of the system view of the process they set up internally with our help, where the inputs are sort of the information they were gathering against each of these indicators. Like I said, they had already basically people in the company monitoring each of these types of information, but not necessarily sensitized to be looking for the type of information that would give us a piece of our mosaic against this analytic problem. So we were able to help with that. And then the rest of this process was really around who would be involved, who has a say in making the assessment, and sort of how it got reported. That takes us to kind of the reporting mechanism they use. If you go back to that slide I showed you earlier from Iraq, this is a little bit more elegant version of the same thing, but fundamentally you see color that communicates severity. You see arrows that indicate trends, and then this sort of, I guess, speedometer gauge here where we have monitor, plan, and act. That was really against where, we've walked through a process with them subsequent to this where we said, what are the conditions that would lead us to take a different action? Maybe it would, we're going to cancel this product development effort, or we're going to invest in a different strategy against this market. And they had identified some of those, and if this needle was at act, that would indicate they were sort of at the trigger point. Really effective in terms of combating organizational inertia, which can be a huge problem here. Even if you see all the signs very clearly, it can be difficult to get large, successful organizations to move. So when you put it in the context of this, and there's a periodic review, we're looking at this every quarter, we're looking at it every month, maybe not quite as frequently. But once everybody's kind of comfortable with this, and they say, all right, when these conditions are met, we're going to do X, that can really help you get over that organizational inertia. Important, we want to identify opportunities. I've obviously sanitized this because there were some strategic things that they chose to do. But we want to identify out of this process, always you will see opportunities to take advantage of these trends or the potential disruptions. So we got to make sure we document that, think about that, what that means to us, and put a planning effort behind it, which is sort of where this slide led to. And a couple other examples here at the end, just in terms of some of the scenario planning they did and different strategic contingency plans that they put together. I apologize, I was rushing there at the end a little bit, but I wanted to make sure we left some time for questions. I very much appreciate all of your attention. I hope you found this was useful. And Jim, I guess we can go ahead and open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. In fact, we have a number of questions already, so people have been paying attention, which is very good, and have a number of questions. And we're going to go back to the very beginning when you were talking about the different types of logic. And the question is, would you ever define reverse logic as crowdsourcing? So when you're looking at the 10 people and picking stuff out, the best answers, how would you define that? Would you define that as crowdsourcing? Would it work?
Yeah, so I think, in the examples I use might be a bit confusing there, but when you inductive and reverse, I think you can use an analogy of crowdsourcing. So if we're going to crowdsource an answer to a particular strategic question, or any question for that matter, and we ask 10 people for their answer, really the difference between inductive and reverse, inductive reasoning and reverse logic really, in inductive reasoning, we would ask 10 people for their answer, and if we ask 10 people, should we have an acquisitive strategy, organic strategy, or a mix? And all 10 of them said we should buy competitor A. The rest of their comments were different, but they all said we should buy competitor A. The inductive approach would be say, okay, that's our answer. Everybody agrees, we're going to buy competitor A. Reverse logic is more like, let me frame it this way, the same question. So if we ask the question, should we have an acquisitive strategy, an organic growth strategy, or both? Reverse logic would be to say, okay, well, what conditions would have to be present to make an acquisitive growth strategy the best choice? And we would start from there and then say, well, maybe it's, it's a very fragmented market would make sense. In that case, then an acquisitive strategy might make sense. And we would come up with other conditions that would necessarily have to be met in order to make whatever choice we were talking about the right answer. Does that make more sense, hopefully? It's not really about crowdsourcing, and the 10 people example might be a little bit misleading.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I mean, to me, crowdsourcing, I always think of sort of large numbers of people, whether it be through a poll or whether it's sort of, multiple input sort of idea. So that it certainly makes sense to me.
Sure.
One other question here is, how is the strategic route different from agile thinking? So if we're looking at the analytical route and the creative route, and you're talking about those various approaches. So I guess the question is, how is the strategic route different from agile thinking?
How is it? I'm sorry. How's it different from what thinking?
Agile. So
agile thinking. Yeah. No. I mean, there's a lot of similarities. I mean, fundamentally, agile would be, the notion we're going to come up with an idea, we're going to get it very quickly to market, and we're going to get lots of feedback, and we're going to iterate. We're going to iterate constantly. This is a little bit different. This is, think about this in the context of a doctor, right? So this is a problem that has to be solved. There's a malady of some sort that needs to be diagnosed. Very similar to what you might think of as a strategy consultant who's come into a company from the outside and said, here are our challenges, what should we do about it? That would be kind of the same approach here, where we're going to say, all right, there's lots and lots of options, there's lots of uncertainty. We could go fill all of our gaps in knowledge by digging into data first and use the analytical approach. But it's more effective in our context to let's structure the problem with options. Let's talk about, what are the 4 options? Let's start there. And then maybe we can use reverse logic to say, okay, out of option A, B, C, and D, what conditions would have to be met to make each of those the best choice? And that's when we would then dive back down into the data and validate it. Again, like a doctor sort of saying, you either have, a sinus cold, or you've got, a bacterial infection, or you might have cancer. And so we know it's one of those 3 probably. Now we're going to go dive into the data and run tests to determine which of those 3 you have. So we know, what the correct course of action would be from a treatment standpoint. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely, that makes sense to me. Some great questions here. I think that this has been an excellent presentation. I know we're coming up fairly close to the hour, and we said one more question I was going to ask is with regard to the Olympus case that you presented. Was it, this is sort of technical, so during or after their 510K clearance, if you can, and did the timing of when it was done, the analysis, I take it, make a difference?
So if I understood the question correctly, you're asking, was the project done before the 510K clearance for the project Olympus was working on?
Right.
If that's the question, it was before. And the timing, I think it does matter in terms of mitigating potential exposure or potential loss. In this case, they actually chose to go a different direction. And it was, fortunately before they had committed a significant amount of capital. So ideally you want to do these sorts of stress testing efforts, and that's what I kind of refer to this as from a strategy development standpoint, as early in the process as you can. So as to avoid any opportunity costs that you might experience by making the decision late, or, if you're thinking of in the context of disruption, before it is too late, frankly. Right, so the earlier in the process you can start to do some of this type of thinking, I think the better.
Certainly, I entirely agree. I mean, if they do the process when they're quite far into the process, the game of catch-up isn't so easy to play, if that's the route that you choose to go. And so I think it's a little bit tricky. So getting things started way ahead of time, I think, is an important part of that. And I think that with this whole process, and if you look at the area of so much information that's coming at us, particularly here, we're in Special Library Association, we're dealing with people from the information world. Do you have any insights as to what types of sources or from a research perspective and a trend following perspective that you'd are your top 5, whether it be primary, secondary research sources that you like to use? Is it
Sure. I mean, there is a vast array, right? I think that a couple points here. One, as I said before, it's been our experience in working with companies that the vast majority of information that you need to be able to put a picture like this together, somebody in the organization is already looking at it. 85% of the time, I would venture to say. There are, of course, some instances where you might need to go out and get a new source or get access to different information or bring a third party in to do some kind of bespoke work for you. But most of the time, as I said, the information is there. The bigger challenge is knitting it all together across a big, complicated enterprise. The second comment I would make is that having a platform in which you can put all this information in a centralized way, organize it, and collaborate around it, I think, is really important. There's a number of options out there on the market. Our generous sponsor today, Aurora, has one. We at Cypher have one, and there are a couple others out there. But I do think that there's huge utility in the notion of having a centralized platform that you can work around this information and knit all of those disparate nuggets together in one place so you can start to see this kind of mosaic emerge. So that's kind of the 2 points I would make.
Perfect. I mean, I think that's sort of where I was looking to go, because I think that the coordination of the information, there's so much out there in the sense that how we actually keep track of it all and what's of value versus what sort of noise is a very important piece to this sort of the analysis of all the information that's out there. So coming up to the top of the hour, I just want to thank you, Peter, for this wonderful presentation. I mean, this is excellent as far as looking at the trend monitoring and how it's done. And I just want to let everyone know that this webinar has been recorded, and it will be available on the SLA CID YouTube channel. Links through our website, and so all of our webinars are there as well. And I just want to thank Aurora WDC for their sponsorship of SLA, and in particular the CI division, and they've been a great sponsor for our division, and they've sponsored this webinar, providing technical support, and always been there. So I just want to thank them. And for Aurora WDC, they're actually just opening up their invitations for and registration for their Reconverge G2, which was coming up in early 2019. So stay tuned for announcements on that with regard to open registration when it's opening, and as well as discounts for SLA members, which is a great thing. And also just to stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be coming up in November. So we're just finalizing that, and we should have registration information for that webinar out shortly. So please be on the lookout for that, and we hope you enjoy your day. And again, thank you to Peter Grimm from Cypher Systems for this wonderful presentation, and as well to Aurora WDC for sponsoring today's webinar. So thank you and have a great day.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Aurora.